In the winter of 1901, construction workers demolishing an old courthouse in Salem County, Massachusetts, discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Behind a sealed brick wall in the basement, they found a leather bag containing documents so disturbing that the county clerk refused to catalog them for 3 months. Inside were medical journals, testimonies, and photographs detailing the case of 2 women who caused an entire town of 200 people to experience synchronized hallucinations on the same night. What the doctors documented wasn't just madness. It was something that spread like a disease, infecting everyone who came near them. The physician who studied them wrote in his final entry, "I can no longer trust my own eyes. What I have witnessed cannot exist, yet I have seen it with dozens of witnesses beside me." This is the true story of the Blackwood sisters and what they did to the town of Hollow Creek. Welcome to Beyond the Silent Woods, where we uncover the darkest mysteries hidden in forgotten archives. Before we dive into this disturbing case, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We're tracking how this story spreads across the world, and your comment becomes part of this documentary's history. In the autumn of 1901, during the demolition of the old courthouse in Salem County, Massachusetts, construction foreman Marcus Thorne made a discovery that would force historians to reconsider everything they knew about early 20th century America. Hidden behind a bricked-up wall in the basement archive, sealed within a deteriorating leather satchel, were documents that told a story so disturbing that the county clerk, Elizabeth Morrison, initially refused to believe they were authentic. The documents, dating from 1902 to 1903, detailed the case of 2 women known locally as the Blackwood sisters, their real names recorded as Victoria and Evangeline Blackwood. What made their story particularly chilling wasn't the accusations of witchcraft that surrounded them, but the methodical documentation of their psychological deterioration and the community's response to behaviors that, even by 1900 standards, defied rational explanation. Dr. Theodore Hartwell, a physician who had studied medicine at Harvard Medical School before establishing a practice in the remote Massachusetts settlements, kept meticulous records of his encounters with the sisters. His journals, part of the discovered cache, reveal a man struggling to apply scientific understanding to phenomena that seemed to transcend the medical knowledge of his time. In his own words, recorded in October 1902, Dr. Hartwell wrote that the sisters exhibited symptoms that appeared to follow no known pattern of disease or mental affliction, yet were consistent enough to suggest an underlying cause that remained frustratingly elusive. The Blackwood sisters had arrived in the isolated community of Hollow Creek in late spring of 1901, during a time when strangers were viewed with particular suspicion. They claimed to be widows from a settlement further north that had been destroyed during a factory fire, though they carried no documents to verify their story and spoke with an accent that the locals found difficult to place. Victoria, the elder at approximately 35 years, was described by those who knew her as a woman of striking appearance but unsettling demeanor. Her sister Evangeline, perhaps 5 years younger, was noted for her habit of speaking in whispers and her tendency to stare directly at people for uncomfortably long periods without blinking. The community of Hollow Creek consisted of fewer than 200 souls, most of them families who had lived in the Massachusetts hills for generations. They were suspicious of outsiders under the best of circumstances, and the rapid industrialization of nearby cities had heightened their natural wariness to near paranoid levels. The arrival of 2 unaccompanied women claiming to be refugees was extraordinary enough to generate weeks of speculation and gossip. Benjamin Ashford, who served as both the settlement's unofficial leader and its primary merchant, initially offered the sisters temporary shelter in an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of the community. The cabin had belonged to the Fletcher family, who had moved to Boston at the turn of the century, leaving behind a small but sturdy dwelling surrounded by overgrown garden plots and a well that, according to local memory, had never run dry, even during the worst droughts. For the first several months, the sisters appeared to integrate into the community as well as could be expected. They attended the small Methodist church where Reverend Samuel Pierce delivered weekly sermons to whoever was available to listen. They purchased supplies from Ashford's store, paying with silver coins that were unusual in their minting but appeared genuine. Victoria demonstrated skill with herbal remedies, helping several community members with minor ailments using plants she gathered from the surrounding forests. It was Evangeline's knowledge of medicinal plants that first raised eyebrows among the more observant residents. She seemed to possess an understanding of the local flora that typically took years of living in the Massachusetts hills to develop, yet she had supposedly arrived from a distant settlement only months before. When questioned about her expertise, she would simply smile and say that plants were the same everywhere if you knew how to listen to them. Dr. Hartwell's first detailed encounter with the sisters occurred in September 1901, when he was summoned to examine Victoria after she collapsed during Sunday services. His initial assessment noted nothing more alarming than exhaustion and poor nutrition, both common enough conditions during that era. However, he also recorded several observations that troubled him. Victoria's pulse was unusually slow, her skin temperature appeared lower than normal, and her pupils showed minimal response to changes in light. When he questioned her about these symptoms, she claimed to feel perfectly well and insisted that she had merely been overcome by the heat in the cramped church building. If you're still watching and finding this case as disturbing as we are, please hit that like button and subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods. Drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. We want to map how far this story reaches. Your engagement helps us bring more forgotten cases like this to light. The winter of 1901-1902 was particularly harsh, with snow falling earlier and more heavily than the old-timers could remember. The sisters' cabin was isolated enough that they could go weeks without being seen, emerging only when necessity demanded trips to Ashford's store for supplies. It was during one of these winter supply runs that Benjamin Ashford first noticed what he later described as their peculiar relationship with the cold. According to Ashford's written account discovered among the courthouse documents, the sisters would arrive at his store during blizzards wearing clothing that seemed inadequate for the weather, yet they showed no signs of being affected by the cold. Their skin maintained a normal color. They didn't shiver or seek warmth near his wood stove, and Evangeline had once commented that she found the winter air invigorating rather than unpleasant. Most disturbing to Ashford was the observation that snow didn't seem to accumulate on their clothing or hair the way it did on other customers, as if their body heat was somehow insufficient to melt the flakes as they landed. As spring arrived in 1902, the sisters' behavior began to change in ways that the community found increasingly disturbing. They started making nighttime visits to the small cemetery behind the church, not to tend graves or pay respects, but apparently to sit among the headstones for hours at a time. Several residents reported seeing them there on moonlit nights, sitting perfectly still and silent, facing different directions as if they were keeping watch. Reverend Pierce attempted to address this behavior by speaking with the sisters directly. His account of their conversation, preserved in a letter to his denominational superiors, reveals his growing concern about their spiritual state. When he questioned them about their nocturnal cemetery visits, Victoria explained that they found the silence of the graveyard conducive to prayer and meditation. When pressed about why they couldn't pray in their own cabin or during regular church services, Evangeline responded that the dead were better listeners than the living because they had no agenda other than peace. The Reverend noted that both sisters spoke about death with a familiarity and comfort that he found deeply unsettling. They didn't discuss it with the reverence and appropriate fear that Christian doctrine demanded, nor with the grief that would be expected from recent widows. Instead, they spoke of death as if it were simply another state of being, no more significant than sleep or wakefulness. Dr. Hartwell was again summoned to examine the sisters in late spring 1902, this time at the request of several community members who had observed them exhibiting what they described as seizures or fits. The physician's journal entry from this period describes a scene that defied his medical training and experience. He arrived at their cabin to find both women conscious and apparently lucid, but displaying synchronized movements that they seemed unable to control or explain. The movements, as Dr. Hartwell documented them, consisted of rhythmic swaying motions accompanied by low humming sounds that seemed to harmonize despite neither sister appearing to listen to the other. When he spoke to them, they responded normally and intelligently, but the swaying and humming continued throughout the conversation. When he asked them to stop the movements, they claimed not to understand what he was referring to, as if they were completely unaware of their own actions. Most disturbing to the physician was his observation that the sisters' movements were perfectly synchronized despite their sitting several feet apart and not appearing to pay attention to each other. The humming sounds they produced created harmonies that suggested musical training, yet both sisters claimed to have no particular musical abilities and couldn't explain the sounds they were making. During this same visit, Dr. Hartwell noted other abnormalities that he struggled to document in medical terms. Both sisters' hair had begun to change color, shifting from their original brown to a shade that he described as almost translucent in certain lights. Their fingernails had become unusually long and hard despite showing no signs of deliberate growth or care. Most puzzling was their breathing pattern, which seemed to slow dramatically when they weren't speaking, to the point where the physician sometimes had difficulty determining whether they were still breathing at all. The community's tolerance for the sisters' increasingly strange behavior began to erode. As summer progressed, reports began circulating of unusual occurrences in the vicinity of their cabin. Animals found dead without apparent cause, plants withering despite adequate rainfall, and a persistent odor that residents described as resembling old flowers mixed with damp earth. Benjamin Ashford documented several specific incidents that contributed to the growing fear surrounding the sisters. In June 1902, 3 of his chickens were found dead near the fence that bordered the sisters' property. The birds showed no signs of predation or disease, but their bodies were discovered arranged in a precise triangular pattern that suggested deliberate placement. When Ashford questioned the sisters about the incident, they expressed surprise and offered to pay for the lost poultry, but their demeanor struck him as oddly detached, as if they were responding to news about events in a distant location rather than something that had occurred on their own property. A more serious incident occurred in July when young Thomas Sullivan, the 17-year-old son of a local family, fell seriously ill after accepting water from the sisters' well during a particularly hot day. The youth had been helping with harvest work on farms throughout the area and had stopped at the sisters' cabin seeking refreshment. According to his own account given to Dr. Hartwell after his recovery, Victoria had invited him to drink from their well, claiming that their water was especially pure and refreshing. Within hours of consuming the water, Thomas began experiencing symptoms that Dr. Hartwell found difficult to categorize. The young man reported vivid hallucinations involving conversations with deceased relatives, periods of lost time where he couldn't account for his actions or whereabouts, and a persistent sensation that his thoughts were being observed or influenced by an external presence. Most alarming was his claim that he could hear the sisters' voices, even when they were nowhere nearby, speaking to him in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. Dr. Hartwell's treatment consisted primarily of induced vomiting and purgatives, standard medical responses to suspected poisoning. However, the physician privately noted that Thomas's symptoms didn't correspond to any known toxins or diseases. The hallucinations were too specific and coherent to suggest ergot poisoning or other common causes of delirium, and the duration of the symptoms extended far beyond what would be expected from contaminated water. The incident with Thomas Sullivan marked a turning point in the community's relationship with the sisters. What had been suspicion and unease transformed into active fear and hostility. Reverend Pierce began delivering sermons that, while not explicitly nomming the sisters, clearly referenced the dangers of harboring evil influences within the community. Benjamin Ashford stopped extending credit for supplies and began requiring immediate payment for all purchases. Most significantly, Dr. Hartwell initiated what he termed observational studies of the sisters, attempting to document their behavior in a systematic way that might provide insights into their condition. If this story is keeping you up at night like it does us, show your support by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications for Beyond the Silent Woods. Comment below with your location and the time you're watching. We're creating a map of how this case spreads across the globe. Every comment matters. The physician's detailed observations, conducted over several weeks during the late summer of 1902, paint a picture of two individuals whose behavior had become so far outside normal human parameters that he began to question his own sanity. He documented their daily routines, noting that they seemed to require very little sleep, often remaining active throughout the night hours. Their eating habits were minimal and irregular, with both sisters sometimes going days without consuming food, yet showing no signs of weakness or hunger. Most puzzling to Dr. Hartwell was their apparent ability to coordinate their actions without visible or audible communication. He observed instances where one sister would begin preparing for an activity moments before the other would arrive to participate, as if they possessed some form of shared awareness that transcended normal human senses. When he questioned them about this coordination, they seemed genuinely puzzled by his inquiries and claimed that they simply understood each other well after years of living together. The physician's scientific training led him to hypothesize various explanations for the sisters' condition. He considered the possibility of shared delusions brought on by psychological trauma from their supposed past experiences. He investigated potential environmental causes, testing the water from their well and examining the plants in their garden for toxic properties. He even explored the possibility that they might be suffering from some unknown disease that affected their nervous systems in ways that medicine hadn't yet discovered. However, every rational explanation seemed to fall short of accounting for the full scope of their unusual behavior. The sisters' physical health appeared excellent by all conventional measures, yet they exhibited symptoms that suggested profound neurological abnormalities. Their mental faculties seemed intact when assessed individually, yet their synchronized behaviors suggested either shared psychological dysfunction or some form of coordination that defied medical understanding. As autumn approached, the tensions between the sisters and the broader community reached a critical point. Several families began avoiding the area around their cabin entirely, forcing them to take longer routes when traveling between farms or to Ashford's store. The sisters' presence in church became increasingly uncomfortable for other congregants, who complained that the women's behavior during services was disruptive and disturbing. Reverend Pierce documented specific incidents that contributed to this growing alienation. During prayer, both sisters would remain standing while everyone else knelt, claiming that their backs prevented them from assuming the proper position. During hymns, their voices could be heard harmonizing in ways that, while technically beautiful, seemed to transform familiar songs into something alien and unsettling. Most disturbing was their habit of staring at other congregants during the reverend's sermons, not with the polite attention expected during religious services, but with an intense focus that made people feel observed and judged. The situation escalated dramatically in October 1902 when Margaret Ashford, Benjamin's wife, claimed to have witnessed the sisters engaged in what she described as ritualistic behavior near the creek that provided water for much of the community. According to her account, she had gone to the creek early in the morning to collect water for washing and discovered the sisters standing waist-deep in the flowing stream, facing each other with their arms raised above their heads. What made the scene particularly disturbing, according to Margaret Ashford's testimony, was not just their unusual posture, but the fact that they remained motionless for the entire time she observed them, which she estimated at nearly an hour. They didn't speak, didn't appear to be performing any recognizable religious or cultural ceremony, and showed no awareness of her presence despite being clearly visible from her position on the bank. Most unsettling was her observation that the water around the sisters appeared different from the rest of the stream. While the creek normally ran clear, the water immediately surrounding the women seemed darker and moved in patterns that didn't correspond to the natural flow of the current. When she finally gathered enough courage to call out to them, they turned to look at her in perfect synchronization, their expressions showing neither surprise nor embarrassment at being discovered in such circumstances. Dr. Hartwell investigated Margaret Ashford's claims by examining the creek water where the incident allegedly occurred. His analysis, conducted using the limited testing methods available in 1902, revealed nothing unusual in the water's composition or appearance. However, he noted in his journal that several fish were found dead downstream from the location, their bodies showing no signs of injury or disease, but displaying what he described as unusual rigidity that persisted even after death. The physician's scientific skepticism led him to question whether Margaret Ashford might have misinterpreted innocent behavior, perhaps observing the sisters engaged in some form of medical treatment or personal hygiene routine. However, when he approached them directly about the incident, their response troubled him deeply. Rather than denying the behavior or offering an innocent explanation, both sisters simply stared at him in silence for several minutes before Victoria finally asked whether he had come to examine them again or simply to satisfy his curiosity about things that didn't concern him. The approaching winter of 1902-1903 brought new challenges as the community grappled with the sisters' continuing presence. Food stores were limited due to economic difficulties, and the normal spirit of mutual assistance that helped rural communities survive harsh seasons was complicated by the fear and suspicion surrounding Victoria and Evangeline. Several families privately approached Benjamin Ashford about the possibility of forcing the sisters to leave the area, but the lack of any actual crimes or legal violations made such action problematic. Dr. Hartwell found himself in an increasingly difficult position as the only community member with any claim to authority regarding medical or psychological matters. His scientific training compelled him to continue studying the sisters' condition, yet his growing unease about their behavior made him question whether such study might be dangerous. His journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling with doubts about his own perceptions and sanity. In November 1902, the physician made a decision that would prove to have devastating consequences for all involved. Believing that the sisters' condition might be related to their isolated living situation, he arranged for them to stay temporarily in the home of Robert and Catherine Hayes, an older couple whose own small dwelling was located closer to the center of the community. The Hayes had agreed to the arrangement partly out of Christian charity, and partly because Dr. Hartwell had convinced them that closer observation might help him develop a treatment for whatever was affecting the sisters. Are you still with us on this disturbing journey? If this case is fascinating you as much as it haunts us, drop a like and subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Your location becomes part of this documentary's legacy. We read every single comment. The Hayes household consisted of Robert, a retired carpenter in his 60s, his wife Catherine, and their unmarried son Daniel, a man of about 30 who had been injured in an industrial accident and had returned home to help with the family's small farm. The family had lived in Hollow Creek for over 20 years and was respected by their neighbors for their strong work ethic and religious devotion. Dr. Hartwell's plan was to monitor the sisters' behavior in a more controlled environment, while also determining whether their unusual symptoms might be related to something specific about their isolated cabin. He hypothesized that environmental factors such as contaminated well water, toxic molds, or naturally occurring gases might be causing their symptoms, and that relocation might lead to improvement in their condition. The arrangement began in late November with what appeared to be positive results. Both sisters seemed more animated and social when living in closer proximity to other people. They participated in household tasks, contributed to conversations, and showed what Dr. Hartwell interpreted as signs of psychological improvement. Victoria assisted Catherine Hayes with cooking and preservation of winter food supplies, while Evangeline helped Daniel with minor repairs and maintenance tasks despite his physical limitations. However, this apparent improvement lasted only a few weeks before new and more disturbing behaviors began to emerge. The Hayes family started reporting that both sisters would disappear from their beds during the night hours, returning before dawn with no explanation for their absence. When questioned about these nocturnal wanderings, the sisters claimed to have no memory of leaving the house and expressed confusion about why anyone would think they had been absent. More troubling were the changes that began affecting the Hayes family themselves. Catherine complained of vivid dreams involving conversations with deceased relatives, similar to the symptoms experienced earlier by young Thomas Sullivan. Daniel reported hearing voices calling his name from outside the house, voices that seemed to come from the sisters even when they were clearly asleep in their beds. Most disturbing was Robert Hayes' gradual decline into what Dr. Hartwell initially diagnosed as depression, but which soon began to resemble something far more serious. The elder Hayes began exhibiting behaviors that his family found completely out of character. A man who had previously been known for his steady temperament and practical approach to problems became increasingly agitated and paranoid. He accused his neighbors of plotting against his family, claimed to hear threatening messages in casual conversations, and began spending hours staring out windows as if watching for some anticipated danger. Dr. Hartwell attempted to treat Robert Hayes with standard remedies for nervous disorders, including laudanum and herbal sedatives, but the man's condition continued to deteriorate. More alarming was the physician's observation that Hayes' symptoms seemed to mirror, in some ways, the synchronized behaviors he had documented in the sisters. The older man began exhibiting rhythmic movements and producing low humming sounds, particularly during the evening hours when the sisters were present. By December 1902, the situation in the Hayes household had become untenable. The family was requesting that the sisters be relocated, but winter weather made moving them back to their isolated cabin problematic. Dr. Hartwell found himself managing what amounted to 5 patients instead of 2, as every member of the Hayes family was now exhibiting symptoms that defied his medical understanding. The crisis reached its peak on the night of December 21st, the winter solstice. According to the accounts preserved in the courthouse documents, all 5 individuals in the Hayes house simultaneously experienced what witnesses described as a form of collective seizure or trance state. Neighbors who lived nearby reported hearing unusual sounds from the house, low humming or chanting that seemed to involve multiple voices harmonizing in patterns that were both musical and deeply unsettling. When concerned neighbors investigated the next morning, they found all 5 occupants of the house standing motionless in the main room, arranged in a precise circle facing inward toward each other. Their eyes were open, and they appeared conscious, but none of them responded to questions or seemed aware of the visitor's presence. They remained in this position for several hours before gradually returning to normal consciousness, with no memory of the incident or explanation for their behavior. Dr. Hartwell's account of this event, written several days later, reveals a man whose scientific worldview had been fundamentally shaken. He admitted that he could provide no medical explanation for what had occurred and began to question whether the sister's condition might be related to factors that fell outside the scope of conventional medicine. Most troubling was his observation that the incident seemed to have created a permanent change in the Hayes family, who continued to exhibit subtle behavioral abnormalities even after the sisters were relocated. The decision to move the sisters back to their isolated cabin was made immediately following the solstice incident. Despite the hazardous winter conditions, the community had reached a consensus that whatever was affecting the women was somehow contagious or transmissible to others, and that physical separation was the only way to protect the broader population. Several men from the community volunteered to escort the sisters back to their dwelling and to ensure that they remained there for the remainder of the winter. However, when the escort party arrived at the sisters' cabin the following day, they discovered that Victoria and Evangeline were already there, despite having been left at the Hayes house the previous evening. The men found them sitting by a fire in their main room, apparently engaged in normal domestic activities, with no explanation for how they had traveled several miles through difficult terrain during a winter night. When questioned about their nighttime journey, the sisters seemed genuinely puzzled by the inquiries. They claimed to have been in their cabin all along and expressed confusion about why anyone would think otherwise. Most disturbing to the escort party was the fact that there were no tracks in the snow leading to or from the cabin, despite the fresh snowfall that had occurred throughout the night. The isolation imposed on the sisters following the December incident was intended to be temporary, lasting only until spring weather would allow for a more permanent solution to their presence in the community. However, as the weeks passed with no contact with the outside world, reports began reaching the rest of the community that suggested the sisters' condition was continuing to deteriorate in ways that were both disturbing and inexplicable. Hunters and trappers working in the forests around the sisters' cabin reported seeing strange lights emanating from their dwelling during the nighttime hours, lights that didn't appear to come from normal oil lamps or fires. The illumination was described as having an unusual color, somewhere between blue and green, and seemed to pulse or flicker in patterns that suggested some form of intentional signaling rather than random variations in flame intensity. More troubling were reports of sounds coming from the area around the cabin, sounds that didn't correspond to any normal human activities. Witnesses described hearing what sounded like multiple voices speaking or chanting in languages they couldn't identify, often continuing for hours during the night. Some reported hearing what sounded like music, but played on instruments that no one in the community possessed or recognized. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this case as compelling as we do, please hit that like button and subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods. Drop a comment with your location and the current time. We're mapping how this story travels around the world, and your participation makes you part of this investigation. Let us know if you're brave enough to keep listening. Dr. Hartwell attempted to investigate these reports by conducting nighttime observations of the cabin from a distance, using a position in the forest that provided a clear view of the dwelling while maintaining enough separation to ensure his own safety. His journal entries from these observation sessions described phenomena that challenged his attempts to maintain scientific objectivity. On multiple occasions, the physician observed figures moving around the exterior of the cabin in patterns that seemed too complex and coordinated to be the result of normal household activities. The figures appeared to be performing some form of ritual or ceremony, moving in circles and geometric patterns while maintaining perfect synchronization despite the darkness and uneven terrain. What made these observations particularly disturbing was Dr. Hartwell's growing conviction that he was witnessing more than two figures moving in the darkness around the cabin, despite knowing that only Victoria and Evangeline were supposed to be present. The physician's journal entries became increasingly fragmented and difficult to follow as winter progressed into early 1903. He wrote of seeing shapes that defied description, of hearing sounds that seemed to come from inside his own head rather than from external sources, and of experiencing periods where time seemed to behave in ways that contradicted his pocket watch and the position of the stars. Most disturbing was his admission, written in late February 1903, that he could no longer be certain whether his observations were documenting objective reality, or whether he himself had become infected with whatever psychological condition afflicted the Blackwood sisters and the Hayes family. He noted that he had begun experiencing vivid dreams similar to those reported by other community members who had come into close contact with the sisters, and that he sometimes found himself standing in his own bedroom in the middle of the night, with no memory of having gotten out of bed. The final crisis began in early March 1903, when several community members reported simultaneously experiencing what they described as a calling or summoning sensation that drew them toward the sisters' cabin during the night hours. These individuals, who had previously maintained careful distance from the dwelling, found themselves walking through the forest in the darkness, drawn by what they described as voices or music that they could hear only in their minds rather than with their ears. Benjamin Ashford documented the testimony of 7 different individuals who experienced this phenomenon on the same night. Their accounts were remarkably consistent despite the witnesses having no opportunity to coordinate their stories. Each described feeling an overwhelming compulsion to travel to the sisters' cabin, a compulsion so strong that they found themselves outside their homes before fully realizing what they were doing. Several reported seeing other community members also walking through the darkness, all moving in the same direction like sleepwalkers, responding to a shared dream. The group that gathered outside the sisters' cabin that night included Dr. Hartwell, who had been observing from his usual position in the forest when he felt the same compulsion overcome his scientific detachment. According to his account, approximately 20 people from Hollow Creek stood in a circle around the cabin, watching as strange lights pulsed from within and listening to sounds that seemed to resonate not through the air but directly in their bones and skulls. What happened next remained unclear in the surviving documents, as the accounts of those present contained significant gaps and inconsistencies. Several witnesses reported experiencing a period of lost time, finding themselves back in their own homes hours later with no clear memory of how they had returned. Others described seeing the sisters emerge from the cabin and move among the gathered crowd, touching each person's forehead and whispering words in an unknown language. Dr. Hartwell's account was among the most detailed but also the most troubling. He wrote that he witnessed Victoria and Evangeline standing in the doorway of their cabin, but that their appearances had changed in ways he struggled to describe. Their features seemed to shift and blur when looked at directly, and their bodies cast shadows that moved independently of any light source. Most disturbing was his observation that both sisters appeared to be speaking simultaneously in perfect unison, their lips forming the same words at the same instant, as if controlled by a single consciousness. The physician's final journal entry, dated March 15, 1903, consisted of only a few lines written in handwriting that showed signs of extreme agitation. He stated that he could no longer continue his observations or his medical practice, that his own mind had become compromised by whatever influence emanated from the Blackwood sisters, and that he was leaving Hollow Creek immediately before he completely lost the ability to distinguish reality from delusion. The documents discovered in the Salem County Courthouse ended abruptly at this point. There was no resolution to the case, no explanation for what became of the Blackwood sisters, and no clear account of how the situation in Hollow Creek was ultimately resolved. The final document in the collection was a brief note from county officials dated April 1903, stating that the settlement of Hollow Creek had been officially abandoned and that its remaining residents had dispersed to surrounding communities. Subsequent historical research conducted after the document's discovery in 1901 revealed several disturbing facts. Census records showed that Hollow Creek had indeed existed as a small settlement in the early 1900s, but had been depopulated by 1903 for reasons that were never officially recorded. Property records indicated that the land where the settlement had stood was purchased by the state and left undeveloped, with explicit restrictions preventing future construction or habitation. Most troubling was the discovery of medical records from nearby towns, showing that at least 15 former residents of Hollow Creek had been committed to psychiatric institutions between 1903 and 1905, all exhibiting similar symptoms that physicians at the time described as a form of shared psychosis, or Foley, applusiers of unprecedented scope and persistence. Several of these individuals remained institutionalized for the rest of their lives, never fully recovering their ability to function independently or to provide coherent accounts of what they had experienced in Hollow Creek. The fate of Dr. Theodore Hartwell was documented in records from Boston, where he appeared briefly in 1903, attempting to secure a position at a medical college. His application was rejected due to concerns about his mental stability, and subsequent records indicated that he spent the final years of his life in a private sanitarium, where he died in 1908. The attending physicians noted that until his death, Hartwell claimed to still hear the voices of the Blackwood sisters speaking in his mind, and that he often exhibited the same synchronized movements and humming sounds that he had documented in his subjects years before. As for Victoria and Evangeline Blackwood, no death records, census entries, or other official documentation of their fate has ever been found. The cabin where they lived was reported to have burned to the ground sometime in 1904, though no official investigation of the fire was ever conducted. Local legend in the area maintains that the site where Hollow Creek once stood is still avoided by hunters and hikers, who report experiencing unusual sensations and hearing unexplained sounds when passing through that section of forest. The documents discovered in the Salem County Courthouse remain stored in a climate-controlled archive, available to researchers by appointment only. County officials initially considered publishing the materials as a historical curiosity, but that plan was abandoned after several archivists who worked extensively with the documents reported experiencing symptoms that eerily echoed those described in the journals and testimonies: vivid dreams, periods of lost time, and the persistent sensation of being watched or influenced by an external presence. The case of the Blackwood sisters stands as one of the most extensively documented examples of mass psychological disturbance in American history, yet it remains almost entirely unknown outside of academic circles specializing in the history of psychiatry and abnormal psychology. The thoroughness of Dr. Hartwell's documentation, combined with the multiple corroborating accounts from other community members, makes it impossible to dismiss the case as simple folklore or exaggeration. Yet the phenomena described defy conventional medical or psychological explanation, even by modern standards. This is the reality that was sealed behind a wall in Salem County, Massachusetts, a story so disturbing that it was literally bricked up and forgotten for decades. The question that haunts every researcher who examines these documents is not just what happened to the Blackwood sisters and the community of Hollow Creek, but whether the influence they wielded, whatever its nature, truly ended with the abandonment of that isolated settlement, or whether it merely went dormant, waiting in the archives for someone to discover it and set it in motion once again. If you made it to the end of this investigation, you're braver than most. Subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods for more cases that were deliberately hidden from history. Hit that like button if this story disturbed you as much as it should. And most importantly, comment below with your location and the time you finished watching. We're tracking something, and your data point matters more than you know. Some stories don't just get told, they spread. And now, you're part of how this one travels. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the darkest corners of forgotten history. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some mysteries were buried for a reason.